Over the past 3 weeks, we've been talking about the resurrection of Jesus. The first week, we looked at the gospel accounts of the resurrection, how they tell the story. And we discovered that there's all kinds of conflicts and discrepancies between their accounts. But what they're agreed upon is that the tomb was empty, the stone was rolled away, the first witnesses who came to the tomb were women, and that afterwards Jesus appeared to his disciples. The second week, we looked at St. Paul the Apostle, who was wanting to understand more clearly what happened. So about 4 years after the resurrection, he went to Jerusalem. He interviewed Simon the Apostle, Simon Peter, and he spoke with James the elder, the brother of Jesus. Probably, in fact, it's most likely, he went to the garden tomb itself to investigate. Probably went inside the place where they said that Jesus' body had laid. And then last week we spoke about how this story seems to have been told over and over again throughout the Middle East in many different religions. Variations, differences between the stories, but always a God-man who is being raised from the dead. I want to look today at 10 theories, 10 of the main theories anyway, as to what actually happened there at the garden tomb. How do we explain it? We know that the very first witnesses were women, and according to John's Gospel, most certainly Mary Magdalene came to the tomb. And when she arrived, she had a theory as to what happened. Let me read this. "But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw 2 angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, 'Woman, why are you weeping?' And she said to them," now here's her theory, she said to them, 'They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him.'" In other words, Mary Magdalene immediately jumped to the conclusion that Jesus' body had been absconded with, had been stolen from the tomb, and that's why it was found to be empty. And the assumption here is that it would have been the enemies of Jesus, those who had been behind his crucifixion, now were heaping a final indignity upon him by taking away his body. Well, I think that Mary Magdalene's initial theory can be quickly put aside because it makes no sense. Why would the enemies of Jesus steal his body? Because in doing so, they had taken somebody who had died and whose body clearly was lying in a tomb, who was an example to anybody that might follow in his footsteps that this is what would happen to them. And by removing the body, they had opened up the possibility of an urban myth being spread abroad that somehow he had walked out of the tomb. That is the last thing that the authorities would want. In fact, if they could have done it, I'm sure they would have hung Jesus' body outside the gates of Jerusalem as an example to all who might blaspheme or all who might go against the authority of the Sanhedrin. I'd like you to just watch this clip for a sec. This is from Jesus of Nazareth. That was a film created by Franco Zeffirelli back in the 1970s. And this particular scene has stayed with me ever since I saw it. This is one of the Jewish leaders who has come to the empty tomb. He's heard that the disciples found the tomb to be empty, and he wants to look for himself. And when he walks into the tomb, this is his reaction.
This is precisely what I feared. His disciples must have come in the night, removed the stone, and taken away the body.
Possible. I had guards here, as you requested.
And your priests were here too.
Now it begins. It all begins.
Now, this is a fictitious character that was created by Franco Zeffirelli in order to serve the purposes of his film, but I think he speaks for all of the Jewish authorities when he says, now it begins. He understood that a tomb being empty like this, not being able to produce the body of Jesus, now meant that it could be claimed that he was raised from the dead. Other variations on this theory are that the Romans had taken the body away. Maybe they were concerned about the trouble that Jesus had been causing to them and wanted to simply get rid of his body and get rid of all trace of his existence. But I think, like the Jewish authorities, they wouldn't have been that stupid. They, from their point of view, who were dealing with a people who were superstitious, and they did not want to fuel that by taking away the body. Normally, the Romans liked to leave bodies on the cross on which they died in order to be an example. So, if anything, they might have opened up the tomb so that people could actually view the body, but I hardly think that they would have stolen the body. Another possibility is Joseph of Arimathea had taken the body away because he was afraid of indignities being heaped upon it. He was maybe afraid that the body would be stolen, and so he had hid it away somewhere else. But that seems far-fetched because sooner or later he would have had to produce the body. When the story started getting out that Jesus was raised from the dead, he would have had to say, look, no, that's not the case. I actually have the body somewhere. Another theory is put forward by the disciples, and you find this in Luke chapter 24, where Jesus appears in the upper room. We're told that Jesus stood among them, and he said, "Peace be with you." And they, that is the disciples, were startled and terrified and thought they were seeing a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you frightened? And why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. See that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. Yet for all their joy they were still disbelieving and wondering, and he said to them, "Have you anything to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. So this second theory is squashed right at the beginning, as we're told that Jesus goes to great lengths to prove that he is not a ghost. He can be touched, he can eat food with them, he has a material body. So that's the second theory. The third theory is called the swoon theory. I love that word, swoon. You don't hear it very much these days. This theory claimed that Jesus never died on the cross, but that he merely swooned. After his crucifixion, which incidentally included a spear thrust to his side into his heart, Jesus was taken down from the cross, wrapped in linen and spices, and placed in a tomb. Yet, according to this theory, he somehow revived, and after 3 days without food and water, after the brutal beating that he had received and then his crucifixion, Jesus unwrapped himself, even though his hands and feet were tightly bound, and he got up from where his body had been lying. He somehow removed the heavy stone in front of the tomb and walked out. I think you can tell from the way I'm saying this, describing it, that the swoon theory just doesn't make sense. And then there's a theory that I found really interesting back in the 1960s. This is called the Passover plot theory. And I don't think it originated with him, but it was put forward in 1965 in a book called The Passover Plot by the British scholar Hugh J. Schoenfield. Now, this is a version of the swoon theory. His theory asserts that Jesus plotted to fake his death to give the appearance that he rose from the dead. In other words, he didn't just swoon and then it turned out that he was alive, but he had planned this out from beginning to end. And there's another book I read, I think it's called A Time for Judas, by Morley Callahan, in which he describes in great detail how Jesus plotted with Judas, who was perhaps the most educated, enlightened of all the disciples, and that together they worked out a plan for how they would fake his resurrection. And by doing so, of course, put a stamp of credibility on his message and on his ministry. Let me just take a moment with this one. I want you to imagine this scenario. We want St. Michael's to grow. We want St. Michael's to be a place where young people and young families come and join us. How can we do that? Imagine me sitting downstairs in the kitchen with our Bible study group, and quite often we would have 12 people exactly who would gather with me for the Bible study. And imagine that one night, over coffee and buns, I put forward the proposal that we fake my death. And I'm sure that at first there would be some opposition to that, but then I would describe it and say, well, what we do is we have somebody rush into the church, shoot blanks at me, pretend to kill me. I'll fall to the ground. There'll be fake blood all over me. And then we'll have my body taken to the funeral home, where hopefully we can get somebody to collaborate with us there and affirm that I am in fact dead. They would then put me in a casket, we'd have a funeral, and then I would be buried in the local cemetery. And then, after 3 days in the casket, and being able to breathe because perhaps there's a straw that goes up to the surface, some of you would come in the middle of the night, you'd dig up my casket, I would get out, and then go away and hide myself somewhere, and you could then claim that your rector had been raised from the dead. Imagine how people would come from near and far to St. Michael's to come to the place where the rector had died and been raised again. How likely does that sound? It's ridiculous, isn't it? Even as I was telling you, I was thinking, this is absurd. And yet, this is what the Passover plot is suggesting. Jesus plotted with his disciples to fake his death and then to say that he had been resurrected, thereby getting his message out to the world. Another theory is the hallucination theory. This is the idea that all who had purportedly seen the resurrected Jesus, that is the disciples, the women, James, Jesus' brother, the crowd of 500 people, and then finally Paul on the road to Damascus, all of them were somehow mentally deranged demented, and they were prone to hallucinations, and they had simply imagined that they had seen the risen Christ. What are the odds that that number of people would all be so deranged that they would have a hallucination? What are the odds that they would all have the same hallucination? And that nobody would notice that there is something a little unbalanced about these disciples? That also doesn't make sense, especially when you read the writings of the disciples and you realize that these were very intelligent people. They were not demented. And certainly when you read the writings of Paul, the arguments are so finely tuned, so complex. The fact that it's all based on a hallucination that he once had is extremely unlikely. Then there's the mistaken identity theory. This is the idea that the disciples, who virtually lived with Jesus for 3 years, never expected him to rise from the dead. Sometime after Jesus' death, they came to the conclusion, though, that he had come back to life, and then they misidentified a complete stranger as the risen Christ. I'm thinking here of the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus. At first they thought it was a stranger who was with them, and then they identified him as Jesus. According to this theory, they got it right the first time. He was a stranger, maybe somebody who bore a resemblance to Jesus. Maybe it was wishful thinking that they projected that identity onto him. But for all of these people over the course of 40 days to mistake a stranger who's weaving in and out of their lives, showing up in the upper room for a meal, and coming to the disciples there at the Sea of Galilee, what are the odds of that being a mistaken identity? Another theory is the wrong tomb theory. According to this theory, the disciples had seen Jesus die on the cross, or at least some of them had. John had, certainly, and his mother, and the other women. And they knew that he had gone to Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. They knew the details, but when they went to see the tomb, they misidentified it and went to the wrong tomb. And this tomb had not been used yet. It was still empty, and the stone was rolled away because it had never been rolled in place to seal the tomb. And so it was all one big mistake. That one really stretches my credulity. I have trouble believing that all of the disciples would have misidentified the place. Surely they would have been set straight. Even if just by Joseph of Arimathea, who owned the tomb, and said, no, that isn't my tomb that you came to visit. Jesus is still buried in the tomb next to it. Then there's the seance theory. This is the theory that Jesus was raised in the same manner that spirits are raised in a seance, through ectoplasmic manifestation. That sounds like something you'd hear in the Ghostbusters movie. It's something that would probably have been popular in the late 19th, early 20th century, during the time when spiritualists were holding seances. But we pretty well exposed those mediums who conducted seances as being shysters, being scam artists that were simply out to fool people and to make some money. Interesting, they always liked to turn the lights down, and they had very strict rules about what could or could not be done during the seance in order that they could set it all up with their mechanisms and their accomplices who would stand behind curtains and that sort of thing. Then there's the theory that Jesus never existed, that the resurrection was simply a legend, very similar to, as I said last week, all the other legends, all the other myths that were held around the Middle East, and that this was simply another one of those legends. Okay, I've given you 10 theories. I'll give you one more as a bonus theory. This is the theory of the mushroom cult. Back in the 1960s, there was a book written by John Allegro entitled The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. Maybe you remember it. I remember reading it when I was young. And in this book, Allegro makes the bold claim throughout the book that, in fact, it was all a mushroom cult, that nothing that is described in the Gospels occurred, that it was all an hallucinogenic experience that was brought on through the use of mushrooms. Coincidentally, this theory gained some traction for a short while during the time when people were experimenting with LSD and mescaline back in the 50s and 60s, the time of Timothy O'Leary, and it's not got any roots. It hasn't got any traction because it's a kind of a wild theory that has just been taken out of the air, and there's nothing to indicate that people were using mushrooms to induce hallucinogenic experiences. So I've given you some of the theories then that have been circulating over the centuries for what actually happened there in the garden. But I want to go back to what I've been saying all through this series and just really emphasize this. All we know is the tomb was empty. We're certain of that. We know that the stone was rolled away, that even though they disagree about which women were at the tomb, the gospel writers are all agreed that women came to the tomb first and that Jesus appeared to his disciples. Now, we get kind of lazy with our speech sometimes when we're talking about the resurrection, and we say the disciples saw Jesus. They saw the risen Christ. Interestingly, the language of the Bible is not that way. It's not as if Jesus was some kind of an objective phenomenon, something in front of them that they saw with their senses, but rather we're told in Scripture that he appeared to his disciples. That's quite different. Jesus took the initiative to appear, or God took the initiative to cause Jesus to appear to his disciples. Now, what does that mean? What exactly happened? What does it mean for Jesus to appear to his disciples? Was he here or wasn't he here? Was he physically present, or was it some kind of a semi-physical presence? Because at other times it appears like he's walking through doors and walls, for instance, into the upper room to gather with the disciples. So what exactly is the substance of his body? And as people who have been brought up in a scientific age, we want to know, what is this resurrection? And how can we, as people with minds that were trained in the scientific method in school, who believe in factual evidence to be the basis of belief, how can we possibly believe something that we don't understand? So I think I'm going to leave you this week with that question, and I'll bring the series to a close next week and tell you what I think the resurrection is all about, what I believe about the resurrection. And granted, this is one person sharing with you what they believe, but hopefully I've kind of built up to it over the past few weeks, and you can guess where I'm heading. But I do believe in the resurrection of Jesus. It's just that I don't necessarily have a simplistic belief or simply believe by faith. I am like Thomas, as I've often told you. I believe because of the evidence. And the evidence is what I want to go over again next week, and what the consequences should be in terms of our faith. I hope you're having a good week. As I record this, the weather is turning really lovely. I'm recording this on the day of the coronation of King Charles III. What an extraordinary experience that was. I'll be talking about that in church. Look forward to our next study. Blessings, and have a good week.